I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. Welcome to the Bonar Institute for Purposeful Leadership webinar series. And I am delighted to introduce Dan Collin and Steve Flinn, whom I am associated with through the ILO Institute. And the ILO Institute is the Institute for Innovation in Large Organizations. And I've been meeting with Steve and Dan virtually. I feel like I know them in person, but actually we've been meeting for how many years on Zoom? 2 or 3, maybe more.
Couple, yeah,
I can't remember.
yeah, a couple,
but
three.
I feel like I've been in a room with you and in person. And I hope we have that opportunity. But I would like to invite Dan and Steve to introduce themselves. Both are true experts in artificial intelligence and in innovation, and they will walk us through some thoughts about what boards should consider about artificial intelligence, and I will ask questions. And I'm delighted that we have a small group of people because that enables it to be more interactive. And we hope to have a very interactive discussion after the presentation is over. There is also a chat feature, and you can always submit comments and questions in the chat feature. I always have questions in advance of the webinar that I use for discussion, but we hope you have them as well. So Dan and Steve, if you could go ahead and get started and tell us about yourselves.
Okay, Dan, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Dan Collin. Thank you, John and James, so much for having us today. Very excited to be here. I'm managing partner for Kickstart Digital. Kickstart Digital is a digital innovation collective comprised of very senior level strategic, technology, and design professionals, coupled with an extended network of software developers, marketing firms, and innovation specialists ranging from executive communications, AI ethics experts, and others. And what we do is we work with large organizations, enterprises, other institutions around the question of digital innovation. We develop strategy, we help with organizational change, making innovation core, as I like to say, and developing new products, new experiences, and new ventures.
Very good. Thanks, Dan. I'm working with Dan in Kickstart Digital, but by way of background, academically, I'm sort of a math, econ, and decision science kind of background. I went to work for Royal Dutch Shell after graduating, worked in a variety of positions there, including CIO in the US and VP of IT strategy and strategic alliances globally. So done sort of the big tech sort of stint. And then I founded a company called Many Worlds. It's really focused on sort of advisory work at the intersection of technology and strategy and decision science. That's one part of it. The other part, though, that really goes back 2 decades now is focus on AI and machine learning, both building systems in that space for enterprises and also focusing a lot on IP, which has resulted in like almost 60 patents in that space, including a couple that we got just this year. And along the way, did a couple books that are kind of at the intersection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, at this point, I wanted to do a quick review of what are the duties of the board of directors. And because it sets the context for today's webinar about what do boards need to know about artificial intelligence? And that's the theme of our discussion. So the board of directors has a different role from management. The board hires and coaches and creates succession plans for the CEO. Publicly held companies and privately held companies have slightly different duties, and certainly publicly held companies are held to higher standards. But members of governance boards have fiduciary duties, the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. Some add a third to say duty of obedience. And those fiduciary duties require the board to help the management set strategy. The board of directors balances the short-term and long-term interests of the corporation or the nonprofit, whatever you are considering. And AI presents very interesting issues in the context of what are the long-term interests that are affected by AI and what are the short-term interests that are affected by AI. And that plays out in the legal duties that board of directors members have. So I'd just like to stop there, but wanted to set the context for our discussion. So Dan and Steve, up to you.
So John sort of hinted at, we have an AI imperative here. There's no question. It's in the headlines daily. But also, as John mentioned, ultimately, the AI imperative has to be for businesses an economic imperative, right? It's a fiduciary sort of imperative. And that's because AI, just like any other technology, is always a means to an end, right? It's not an end of itself. The end in of itself is value. And there's two categories of value for any business. The first is productivity or efficiency enhancements. That's essentially where we're doing kind of the same thing we've been doing, but we're doing it at lower cost. And most of the headlines around AI tend to focus on that, right? It's, we can suddenly do marketing collateral in half the time, or if we're programmers, we can get a first cut set of code that we then tune and our productivity goes up 30, 40%. But the other bucket of value that's sometimes forgotten in the headlines is the strategic value. And that's ultimately always the bigger category of value for any business. And by that, we mean threats and opportunities around the core value drivers of the business, the processes that ultimately are contributing the most to the bottom line. And that strategic value is something that frankly can't be outsourced by the board or senior leadership, right? What you can't do is anoint a AI czar somewhere in the organization and say, come back to us in a couple quarters and give us a readout on what we're doing around AI. If you do that, they will get some productivity enhancements. There'll be the low-hanging fruit and quick wins that everybody talks about, but they won't be focused on strategy. You have to be focused on strategy. You're responsible for that. And your attention on that needs to be continuous. And we're arguing it has to be right now, immediately. And the reason for that is on the next slide. We are in an unprecedented era where we've got a technology/economic inflection point. And our argument is that it's really like no other. I mean, the closest analogy was the advent of the internet in the late 90s. But in many ways, this one is like even more potentially transformational. I mean, Dan's going to touch on some of the impact that came from that wave of the internet. This one, we're just getting started on, and we're starting to see the impact only at the very beginning. It's yet to come over the next few years. And the reason this is so unprecedented is we have at least 3 layers of unprecedented on top of one another. First of all, we've got exponential advances that are inherent to information technology, right, as exemplified by Moore's law. And we also know right off the bat, we're not good at predicting exponential phenomena, right? We had a good example of that with COVID, where in February 2020, we knew about some virus far away. At some point, we might have to deal with it. A few weeks later, our entire world changes, right? We just evolved in a world where most phenomena is linear. It's not exponential, and so we're not wired to deal with it. But on top of that, the normal exponential growth of technology, since about 2018, we've had this other kink in the curve that's been driven by the deep learning technology, and specifically something called a transformers sub-architecture of it. And it has been a vertical ride since 2018, 2019, leading up to what we hear about today with ChatGPT and generative AI. That alone gives us like a double exponential thing, right? So we're in uncharted territory already. But then on top of that, we've got emerging unpredictable advances in this deep learning technology, unlike anything we've ever had with anything else. I mean, in our classic IT, for example, if we write a program and we have sort of a, if this condition, then this happens, we might have thousands of those in series and parallel, very complex systems. And sometimes we get unpredictability, and it's always bad unpredictability, right? It's called bugs. It's like we didn't anticipate some weird thing and it fails. Here with deep learning, we're getting unanticipated upside, capabilities that we weren't really training the deep learning on that suddenly emerge. And that's giving us benefits that, are unlike any other technology. Now, on the other hand, that's also a bit scary, right? That's what spooked even the experts, which is, wait a minute, the people building this don't really understand what's emerging. Maybe we need to slow things down. We don't have time in this webinar to debate the merits of that, but the phenomena is real. That's really happening. But the third layer, which I think may be even a bigger deal for most businesses, is we're just starting to get the integrative advances where we're taking the generative AI language-based kind of things that are so wonderful and starting to hook them together with our classic information technology capabilities and or with other AI technologies that are advancing rapidly as well, but maybe aren't getting the headlines because, we're language-based beasts. So we're very, infatuated with anything that looks like human-based capabilities in language. But a lot of other things are moving as well that are going to have impact on business processes, not just processes where content's being generated, like we're thinking about now, but almost any business process you can think of, including the ones that are driving the most value to your bottom line. So got to be paying attention. And again, we've got to accept that this is a different thing. There is hype out there, there's no question, but ultimately, a couple of years from now, the world's going to look different, just like the world looks very different than it would have a year ago if we'd had this webinar. Okay, so what are the headlines about? Well, the headlines fundamentally tend to, again, focus on the ChatGPT kind of language-based capabilities, and rightly so. I mean, they're just terrific. Nobody expected it, again, as recently as a year ago. And to put that in a little quick context, that's part of, what would be called artificial intelligence or AI, but AI itself is kind of a catch-all term now. It doesn't have a lot of meaning. It just means something intelligence going on in the system. If you get a marketing brochure or something that says AI-based, and it doesn't tell you anything else, it's sort of content-free. I mean, it's just a marketing slogan. Generative AI is more descriptive, of course. It's basically an AI system that's generating content that we as users can consume. And if it's language-based, the models behind that are trained on much of the internet would be called large language models or LLMs. And if it's more general, where it might be also learning from images or outputting images and so forth, or video, then we would call it more generally a foundation model. They're both basically based on this deep learning technology and also really this transformer sub-architecture that revolutionized the field, again, starting in about 2018, 2019. And then if you tweak them a little bit and put sort of a little fairy dust on them so they can converse a little more effectively, you get ChatGPT, for example, or some of the competitors like Google's Bard. And they're also, that technology is being embedded in partners' technology like Microsoft and so on. Now, the thing to keep in mind again now is this is the headlines AI, and that AI is basically only one aspect of the AI that's developing, right? So there are other things going on. And the other thing to note is that the AI community has basically had the goal to create something called artificial general intelligence, AGI. And that's basically AI that has more fluid and powerful intelligence. So it's at least as good as a human across many different areas, right? It's not just better than a human at chess or better at generating a poem or something quickly. It's good at a lot of things and probably at a superhuman level. The message here for the board and senior executives is that if we had this webinar just a year ago, the expert predictions on when we would have AGI would be 2030s, probably more likely 2040s or later. Now, if you look at the prediction markets of experts, the median prediction is within a few years. I mean, 24 to 36 months kind of thing. And so the message has to be, although it's going to sound like science fiction, you've got to basically do scenario planning right now with the idea that AGI kind of capabilities may be able to impact your core processes driving value within a couple of years. And it's going to seem weird. And again, like science fiction, you're going to snicker and go, that's not real, et cetera. That's because we're not wired to deal with this kind of change. The reality is, if a year ago we had this webinar and I told you what was going on right now, I predicted that, you would tell me, this guy's a crackpot. That's the reality we got now. So that's our message. Think about strategy. Think about much better than the capabilities we're seeing right now with ChatGPT being available within 24 months. Okay, so in the meantime, you're going to be buffeted by all sorts of new breakthroughs, breathtaking, sort of this and that and the other thing, buzzwords, et cetera. How do you get signal, and by signal we mean value signal, from all the noise that you inevitably get? Well, I recommend trying to put whatever you're hearing about in something called data to learning to action kind of context. I wrote a book a few years ago that basically called Optimizing Data Learning to Action, that was really making the case that that process underlies pretty much everything that goes on in our own brains or in machine learning, or even the processes that drive value in our organizations. But here I'm just suggesting whatever technology du jour that somebody's talking about, you put it in sort of this data to learning to action framework, which just means starts with what's the input? Is it language, images, maybe it's behavioral kind of information we're collecting or something else? And importantly, is it public data or is it our own proprietary information that we're using? And then how does that get converted to output? If it's machine learning, there's going to be some learning going on. Is that deep learning or some other kind of algorithm? Is it trained? And if so, how? And then importantly, what's the action? What's the output? That's the value part. That's what matters for a business. Unless you're Google or OpenAI or somebody like that, who's in the bowels of the learning, what's important is what it does and how it's different. So is it language, again, that people are consuming directly? Is it driving robotic actions? Is it doing things under the covers where it's making inferences that feed our other systems? That's the key thing. And how is it different? How is it better? How does it impact value for our business is always the key to understand with any of the technology. It's again about value. So Dan's going to talk a whole lot more about the details of the value of AI. And so I will turn it over to him.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so Steve touched on two really critical points, right? The first was the focus on strategic value and creating strategic value. And the second, really, the game-changing nature of this artificial intelligence technology. And when we put those two things together, the implication is structural change, structural transformation. If there were really two phrases that I would say I'd love for everybody to take away from this, the two would be structural transformation in the external environment, in the market, as we're illustrating here, and then the creation of new strategic value, structural transformation externally and internally in our business models, as well as strategic value creation as the catalyst, right? So we've seen this story over and over again, how industries change. Basically, an innovator comes along after a new technology has been introduced and uses that technology to figure out a new way to serve a customer, right? And a classic case is Netflix and Blockbuster in the early days of the internet, as Steve indicated. And when Netflix came along, if you wanted to watch a movie at home, you'd go down to the store and you'd get a cassette and you'd bring it home and pop it in a machine and you'd watch your movie. And when Netflix came along, they used the power of the internet to connect with people directly, to give people the option to access their media remotely. So you'd order it online, you'd have it delivered, and you'd pop it in your player, and you'd watch your movie that way, and you'd gain the convenience of not having to go down to the store, right? And so this was an initial benefit and use of the technology that was kind of interesting and intriguing for a lot of people. But in a pattern that we see over and over again, the incumbent, in this case Blockbuster, doesn't really think very much of the new technology and its use, and doesn't really see the broader implications for change in the industry and as the technology unfolds. So the internet continues to mature, connectivity improves, software improves, and next thing you know, you don't have to get those 3 discs sent to you in the mail. You can just stream the movie right online. And now Blockbuster's in really big trouble. And so this process of innovators coming in and using the technology, the new technology, to come up with new ways to create meaningful value, in the value proposition to the customer, in the form of the product, as we see with the iPhone, in the way that value is produced in terms of operating models and processes. These are the applications of a powerful, game-changing new technology that transform markets. And the patterns are different every time. There's the classic Clayton Christensen model where something new comes in and at first it does seem kind of innocuous, as I described with Netflix, but sometimes it's a real big bang, as with the iPhone. And before the iPhone, we had little pads of paper where we kept our contacts, and then we moved them into these palm devices. We had mobile phones that made calls, and then we had mobile phones that did email and calls. But when Steve Jobs combined the technologies of, again, more advanced internet technology, better connectivity, miniaturization of chips to connect to the web and to process software, he converged them into a new product that actually was not like Netflix, kind of innocuous at the beginning, but was a big bang that really took everybody in the industry by storm. Another really interesting one, in this spirit that structural transformation manifests in different ways, in different scenarios, is Airbnb. And it's interesting, I mentioned it's the innovators who come in and use the new technology to create strategic value. Traditionally, that's almost never, in a big way, the transformational innovations come from incumbents. And in the case of Airbnb, you'd say we wouldn't necessarily expect Marriott to come up with something as radical as Airbnb, particularly since Airbnb basically, over time as it evolved, created a whole new volume of inventory, new rooms, places for people to stay. So this is a classic pattern that incumbents kind of miss it, but it's interesting that Expedia never really came up with this model. Expedia was a digital native, and you might expect that they would be looking at the horizon and they would be thinking about new ways to create value, particularly with the introduction of Steve Jobs' iPhone and the mobile revolution. But Expedia didn't do it either. One of the things that I think is really important in terms of thinking about structural transformation and strategic value creation is that the stakes are really big. It's very different from that kind of operational efficiency that Steve touched on, those productivity enhancements. And Airbnb illustrates that very vividly, because if you look at the stock market and you check the valuations of these companies, as I did yesterday, you'd see that Marriott clocks in around a $59 billion company. Expedia is about a $17 billion company, But today the market values Airbnb at about $94 billion. So it's not just interesting that the incumbents didn't come up with this idea, didn't see the potential to create a new category as Airbnb did, but that new category could create so much new value in the industry, and that opportunity was missed. Unlike Blockbuster, Marriott and Expedia are going strong. Airbnb is not going to take over the market. So there are multiple patterns of transformation. In this case, the creation of a new category, a new segment, and a new slicing of the market. So this pattern, as I said, repeats, and we've seen these cases across the board. There's a general pattern in the way that a game-changing new technology comes in that I think is interesting here as well. And that is that there's a big discovery starts the process. Steve kind of referenced the introduction of the transformer model, which was discovered in 2017 by Google researchers. They published a paper, and people in the AI community recognized that something was different. But the big discovery really isn't known to the wider world until you have the Big Bang. The Big Bang is that iPhone moment when the new product comes in and you know things are going to change. Sometimes the Big Bang's a little quieter, as in the case of Netflix and Blockbuster, but the Big Bang is the moment where the product is introduced and structural transformation is going to change, and that leads to big change. And so this pattern is the generic pattern, the underlying pattern that we see over and over again in these industries and in these industry transformations. This AI moment, as Steve mentioned, is unlike anything we've ever seen before, partly because our economy is so digitally wired now that a new introduction at the level of software can move through the economy, can move through our systems, can move into products so rapidly that change, that path from big discovery to big bang to big change can be very fast. And nowhere is that better illustrated than the story of Chegg. So Chegg, as many of you may know, is an online education platform. And in early May, they stepped up and gave their quarterly earnings announcement for Q1 of this year. And the CEO said, since March, we've seen a significant spike in student interest in ChatGPT. We now believe it's having an impact on our new customer growth. So with this announcement, in a single day, Chegg stock lost 45%. It basically went from hovering around $18 a share all the way down to just above $9 in a single day. And in the months since that time, the 2.5, almost 3 months since that time, the stock has bounced around between $9 and $11 in a trading range, currently closer to $9. And meanwhile, the stock market as a whole has gone up 30%. So getting chegged, we think, might be actually a new verb for what happens when structural transformation comes along and really takes over a market, a category, and a business like Chegg. On the other hand, in stark contrast, we have the example of Khan Academy. I'm sure everybody on the call knows Khan Academy. It's a nonprofit in education, but they've been rolling out innovative products and innovative approaches to helping people learn for several years, and they've grown very dramatically. Khan Academy took a very different approach, and it was a very different approach to the way they run their business. They're innovators at heart, and they're constantly investing and figuring out new ways to improve value, create new value, and improve the value they deliver to their customers. And so they were on the inside track when OpenAI was bringing out the new version of ChatGPT and wanted to find partners that could illustrate the power of ChatGPT. A company like Khan Academy lands on the short list of people that you want to work with if you're OpenAI to demonstrate the power of your tech. And basically, they created this cool little AI over here that they call Khanmigo. You can see him there. And they used the AI not to replace the teacher and not as they didn't put up guardrails to prevent students from using AI to work on their papers. Rather, they created a tutor for students that interactively prompts the student and helps the student work through a lesson. And they did more than that. They actually used the AI to create a a set of features for Conmigo to help the teachers with lesson planning and thinking through how they were going to develop and deliver the curriculum to the student. So Khan Academy, being an innovator, being focused on creating strategic value from the get-go, is on the inside track. And basically what this illustrates is that oftentimes the big change is visible before the big bang actually happens. And when you're proactively investing in innovation, you're proactively thinking about how to change the game, you're on the inside track to make things happen. So the question that comes up now is, what does this strategic value creation look like, and how do we make it happen? And the process basically is breakthrough innovation. And fundamentally, this is about structural transformation on the inside, structural transformation of our business model. That can happen at any level, any of three levels, whether that's at the value proposition in terms of new products or creating new categories and new ventures, obviously new relationships with the customer, new brand experiences, but also the way we produce value back in the shop, production processes, new relationships with suppliers or channels, new core fixed assets that we may invest in this case, actually building up our AI capabilities, our AI infrastructure, and new positioning in the market, thinking through what monetization models are the ones that are going to prevail in the future. But with innovation, which is such a, broadly used buzzword, it turns out that there are really two different kinds of innovation that we need to think about. And again, this goes back to Steve's earlier point. There's what I call reinforcement innovation that basically, supports the existing business model and the existing approach, creating productivity, creating operational efficiency by just doing things better. These are the incremental and evolutionary improvements in the business that help us perform better, create that incremental little bit of performance. Maybe there's some modernization, like moving our IT infrastructure to the cloud. That's reinforcement innovation that maintains the existing order. But breakthrough innovation is the more revolutionary change. Again, at the level of the business model, new products that are fundamentally a little bit different, create value in new ways. These breakthrough innovations and revolutionary approaches to the core value drivers of the business are the things that create the big growth and the big change. And in a digital world, a lot of that change and the nature of these business models is in fact digital. It's digital to the core. So the value itself is digitally derived and digitally formed, and the sources of advantage in an industry also shift as the industry undergoes structural transformation. So there are new sources of advantage like network effects or centrality inside an ecosystem that become more important to the business than things that maybe had prevailed before. And so how do we do this, right? If transforming the business model and embracing more of a digital business model is the what, how do we make that happen? And basically when we work with clients, we sort it into three basic components, and they're kind of three steps. The first is having a comprehensive innovation strategy that thinks holistically about both reinforcement innovation as well as breakthrough innovation, and developing a core capability to produce and execute on that strategy. And so what I like to tell clients is that in a world of constant change, with these occasional big bangs, these occasional transformative technologies like AI, in a world of constant change, we need to make innovation a core competency of the firm for survival as well as for growth and success. And so that's developing a dedicated function inside the business. That function with reinforcement innovation maybe is a supporter of core business units, an enabler to access new technologies and be an early adopter and aggressive user of new technologies, again, for those operational efficiencies. But then it may take decisive ownership over the breakthrough technology, breakthrough innovation process, developing those new products itself. So you want dedicated management, dedicated ownership, and deep integration with the core, as well as the outside innovation ecosystem, to tap into and discover those opportunities and activate them to make them work at scale inside an existing business. The third piece is actually developing solutions and bringing them to market or bringing them to bear on the operations of the business. And this is the area that we hear the most about in the popular press around innovation: lean startup, design thinking, open innovation. All of these are methodologies that are important and very valuable, but they're at the end of the process. After you've developed a coherent strategy, you've thought holistically about your market and your business model, and you've come up with a strategic approach to create new value. You've activated that at an organizational level. Now you're ready to execute. And there are basically multiple ways you can do that. And being systematic in how you do it is super important. So when we summarize it all, we sort of put it into a checklist. From a board perspective, what do we want to be thinking about, right? Structural transformation in the external environment and in our business model, so internal transformation. It's all about understanding the moment, first and foremost. As Steve said, this technology is not only game-changing for markets, it's really hard for us to understand at a human level because we don't naturally relate to exponential change. We don't really relate well to unpredictability from an institutional perspective, as well as just a human perspective. There's a natural tendency towards fear and conservation of what we have. And complexity is not something that works for us naturally. So you have to really dedicate meaningful time and resource. And this is something we do with our clients, thinking through what the implications are for our industry of the new technology. But that's paired with taking stock of the business. And when you have a big bang moment like this, and you have a very fundamental new technology creating structural transformation, as we saw a couple slides ago, it really pays to go back to the roots, go to the very foundation. You know, this is the Bonar Institute for Purposeful Leadership, really thinking through what is the purpose of our business? Why are we here? Who do we serve? What is our vision? And how does it need to evolve in the context of this technological change that's happening? The third piece is to really launch strategic action. Steve emphasized very rightly the importance of moving now on the big things as well as the small things. It's a learning process for the organization as a whole, for the board and executive leadership, and for every individual in the company. So you want to be working at every level. You want to be pursuing those operational efficiencies. You want to be using the technology tactically to improve, you know, how quickly you can produce brochures and marketing and all the other things. These are very valuable. But you also want to be taking meaningful action against these strategic questions of what's going to happen in our market and how do we need to think about why we're here and how it is that we create meaningful value in the ecosystem. And the last point, I think it's really important for boards to keep on their checklist and make sure that their companies, their executives are focusing on is making digital innovation core. I think that's the ultimate call to action from my standpoint, is that change is constant. We're now at a moment of huge change, and the only way you can react to constant change and really get on top of it is to make innovation a core competency. I think that's the biggest structural transformation in the mindset and the approach that we take to our businesses. So I think with that, it's probably a good place to stop. We've got plenty of time for questions. This is, you know, our contact information. As I said, we work with clients at the enterprise level. We also work with investors. We work with funded startups, real true platform plays. So we're available and here to help any way that we can.
It's interesting to me, Dan and Steve, cybersecurity is a theme that I think about when I think about AI. I think about it. There are obviously several cybersecurity issues that arise with AI. But what's very interesting is that now there are regulatory requirements for cybersecurity expertise to exist at the board level. There really are no specific requirements for artificial intelligence expertise to be at the board level. And given the board's strategic role, what do you think a board needs to know about AI in order to function, to exercise its oversight function, to fulfill its fiduciary duties? And can you get that out of the mainstream business media? So if I read the Wall Street Journal and the Harvard Business Review and regional trade publications, will I get enough information to act at a board level? I have many more follow-up questions and comments, and I have my own thoughts about this, but I'd love to get your views about it because I know that you're working with clients right now that face these issues.
I'll be happy to go first. And I know Dan has a lot of thoughts on this topic, but I think the board has to, again, think strategically, right? I mean, there are governance and other issues. John, you're an expert in that field and cautions basically. But on the other hand, as Dan showed, I mean, in the last big transformational era, the key story is incumbents tended to get killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Incumbents basically didn't react quick enough. They didn't understand the internet was something that was beyond just, again, lowering cost or something like that. They didn't get the strategic implication. They didn't move on it. So to me, a key starts with understanding your business and the threats and opportunities, and then keep asking the question with regards to any sort of AI, how might it impact us? You don't need to know a lot of the details. That's why you're getting a lot of noise in, the Wall Street Journal story and people like stories, et cetera. The key is, to me, and I'm a recovering economist, so I have that perspective, even though I've been in the AI world for a couple decades. Think about value and understand what you need to know. What's the value of information, in essence, to basically operate and think about and change strategy if you need to, with, again, the expectation that things are moving potentially very, very fast, so you can't delay. And then, Dan has turned it over to him because specific thoughts about how you do that at the board level.
Mm-hmm. John, it's such a great point that you make, right? We're all just incredibly inundated with news and information about artificial intelligence, and there's an enormous amount of hype, right? People on the call are probably familiar with the famous Gartner hype cycle, where the curve of excitement and interest goes like this. And then we get to some point where all of a sudden, all of the big promises were not really fulfilled, and we become deeply disillusioned, and the excitement curve crashes down. And there's a classic saying in innovation circles that, new technologies, and particularly game-changing technologies, are overestimated in the short run and underestimated in the long run. So from a board perspective, I agree with Steve. I think you want to understand the technology, you want to understand what its intrinsic capabilities are, but you really want to focus on its application. And again, that hype and that news is going to be about 99% focused on tactical things, operational efficiency type things. What you want to do to supplement that news, and you want to be smart as you always are with the news and filtering what you're consuming at that level, is you really want to complement that with information that helps you understand the strategic implications, because 99% of what's going on is not necessarily material to the business in the long run, but it's that 1% that can kill you you really need to worry about. And so I'm talking to a board today about an advisory role, and so sometimes having an external advisor just to check your roadmap and your plans with is a good strategy. You may take that all the way to the level of, again, pivoting the thought from AI to thinking about innovation more broadly, because AI actually, and Steve made this point, it powers so many other technologies. We have a whole wave of immersive technologies that are coming on close on the heels of AI that are going to change interfaces, that are going to change, I could be an AI right now, right? Deep fakes. So to change our relationship to media, And so you want to be thinking holistically about innovation. And maybe the way to do that is to set up an innovation committee at the board or an innovation advisory group. John, I'd love to hear your thoughts because you spend so much time with boards and you come at it from a complementary perspective to what we've been talking about.
I have a lot of thoughts, of course, but my priority is to get participants' thoughts today, and I'll add mine when they're relevant. But I actually do have a question to you and Steve, but I'd like to go first to James de Gaspé Bonar, who has raised his hand. And James is the founder and president of the Bonar Institute for Purposeful Leadership. James, what is your comment or question?
Thanks, John. Well, my comment to start off with is both Steve and Dan. I want to thank you both for a riveting presentation. I have rarely paid as close and as attentive, I'm going to be redundant, attention to a presentation in a very, very long time, and I thank you for that. I found your description of the transformation to be strong and riveting. I'm wondering, though, that when you're speaking about boards, do you also feel that the boards and their members also have to go through a change in mindset to be able to, one, to comprehend what's going on, and two, if they don't, to figure out a way to comprehend it and then how to respond to it? I've sensed that you've been inferring that there may be a change in mindset, but I wasn't sure if that's what in fact you were saying, or if I was reading too much into it. So that's my question.
Well, I'll start this time. I mean, I would say yes. I worked at Microsoft for a number of years. I worked in Microsoft research doing R&D, and I did product development in the global media, advertising and publishing platforms business. And when Satya Nadella came into the company, he did something that was very profound. He basically said we need to shift from being a know-it-all company to a learn-it-all company. And so I think, this emphasis on constant learning just can't be overstated. And James, I very much agree with the line that you're taking. It is very much a part of making the shift, is shifting our mindset. So I think for boards, this technology is very new, and I think dedicating time and energy to training up on the technology is super important. But we have to be in a kind of a continuous learning mindset. We have to recognize that change is constant. We have to do everything we do, driving innovation, adapting to change, understanding change is just got to be a part of the regular everyday course of business.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I might add, I'm supposed to be the AI geek here, right? But as far as I'm concerned, the two most important things with regards to AI are economics, which I've pounded on before, but the other one is psychology. To your point, James, I mean, it isn't just the board, it's everybody.
Yes.
Is fooled by the pace here. I mean, it's unbelievable. Even the experts. I did a presentation, June of last year and then June of this year on sort of out there AGI kind of stuff. And the people, leaders of the development of this AI in places like Google, et cetera, that were sort of flippant about it and, joking about it, suddenly became, wow, we can't believe this happened in 1 year. So it's a psychological thing that I think is, again, slightly unprecedented because the internet moved quickly, but not this quickly. And I think there's actually a psychology here of trying to get past the disbelief that something like in a year could be as big or bigger impact than what's happened in the last 9 months, that's become somewhat normalized now. So again, I think economics and psychology, boom, and then the AI, details follow from that.
I have an interesting comment to make. I regularly listen to podcast interviews of many people. And I listened to a podcast interview of Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. And when he started at Stanford, his professors discouraged him from studying the AI technologies that are now the basis of his business. And he persisted anyway. And so he actually went against the grain. The research funding for AI was going in a different direction. With that, we had been through the AI winter, and so that is a very interesting aspect. And all of a sudden, AI popped on the scene. Even though we've been using AI and machine learning since the 1950s, I've worked on several AI projects, but no one bothered to talk about AI. It was just, well, this is a technique we're going to use to topically classify our content, and no one cared that it was artificial intelligence or machine learning. So it's very interesting. The media hype has raised the issue. Now, I actually, in my innovation practice, innovation clients will say, John, we need to hire an executive who's an expert in AI. What do you recommend? And this is always an interesting question. So, do you look for someone who has industry knowledge and maybe has a PhD or a master's in artificial intelligence? Do you look for someone who has a little bit of training, let's say done some LinkedIn learning classes and Coursera classes, but deep vertical expertise in your industry? I'll give you the example. So Netflix, for example, has posted a job for a product manager in artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is in the title, and the compensation is $900,000 per year in salary, and I'm sure there are going to be stock options as well. Is that the direction you go in to start your AI strategy? How do you get started? I've asked a lot of questions and made comments in this observation, so I'm just curious.
Well, I'll give you my 2 cents again. I don't, at a board level, I don't see, frankly, from my perspective, a PhD, somebody very knowledgeable about AI. I don't see that as something that you need. I don't think the board has to, again, understand, is the model a transformer model under the covers or a diffusion model? Who cares?
Yeah.
The key is, what can it do? And so my general view is somebody that's got their foot in the AI world, either as leading a organization, big organization, or maybe a startup that's had startup experience, but broadly in AI. Somebody with a combination of business and AI, to me, is the best prescription. I've seen examples where we have deep experts in AI, and one of the issues, frankly, just as a side issue, any deep expert in AI is going to be narrowly focused. Mm-hmm. And that'll be a problem right there, okay? Mm-hmm. Because the world is very specialized around a certain kind of deep learning, and they're going to basically be around transformer. They're not going to be aware of the kinds of things DeepMind's doing at Google with reinforcement learning. They're going to be experts on deeply. And again, you don't need that at the board level. What you need is breadth of understanding of the technology combined with a good business economic perspective, in my view.
I would just add very briefly, I think what you really want are people who understand the business dimensions of the technology industry, because my thesis is that we're undergoing a large-scale transformation of the economy, and that the business models that power businesses like Microsoft or Google are increasingly becoming the business models that define and shape all businesses in all industries. These are platform-oriented architectures, ecosystem-based value generation models at the industry level. And so I think it's really important to have people who understand the nature and structure of digital business models and digital competition, who also understand the rhythms, the cadence, and the specific process steps in developing and applying technology, but who step back from that and think about it through a business lens. And the last thing I would say is I think domain expertise is very much overrated in terms of industry domain for innovation. And it's actually more valuable to have seen multiple industries and change and innovation in multiple industries than to really be a vertical expert in a given industry. When you're thinking about structural change, you want to be conceptually, intellectually borrowing from what you've seen around a wide variety of scenarios.
Yeah, I might follow up too, just on the Netflix example, because I think it's illustrative. For Netflix, the recommender engine, the thing that recommends you movies, is core to the business. It is absolutely core. They've been working on it for years. It's, if it gets 2% better or 0.02% better, it's a big deal for them. If something's core, you want the best in the world on it. And if it costs you 900 grand plus stock options, you do it, right? If you're a big company. And so that is the key. The board has to understand what's core, and what's core, get the best resources on it, but they don't need to understand the PhD level stuff themselves. They just need to know this is core, this is priority one, get the best people in the world on it.
I'd like to note officially we end in 1 minute, but we always end up going a little bit over time because sometimes there are questions and comments. So I'd like to ask, are there any more comments and questions? And chat features available, but you can always just unmute. And Anu, I see your camera's on. I'm so happy to see you. I didn't get to welcome you earlier. So welcome, and Maureen, welcome again. So do either of you have a comment or observation?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I think one thing I want to go into, great conversation on what the board's looking and what's happening. Are you seeing some specific examples of deployment of Gen AI? Especially there's so much noise. Two areas that are of really interest to me. One is in this whole conversational AI chatbot area. One is you hear the news, but what is actually happening? I don't see great examples of what's actually happening. And the second one is machine learning. You talked about like the recommender model of Netflix. So machine learning has been existing before Gen AI. You don't need Gen AI for machine learning. But how has Gen AI helped with these machine learning models in terms of either adoption, in terms of making them better and sharper? Any insights on those two areas?
I can take the last question because I know it very well because I've worked in recommender systems for a long time. Underneath the covers now, whether it's Netflix, whether it's Google's YouTube recommender, et cetera, lies deep learning technology. That wasn't the case 3 or 4 years ago. Well, 4 or 5 years ago. It's just been introduced. Some of it's the large language model kind of stuff. If you're like Google search is definitely their BERT large language model. But some of it is like in YouTube, it's deep learning using something we haven't talked about here, reinforcement learning. This is the kind of stuff that's been used to create chess systems that can beat any human and any programmed system, et cetera, that deep minds work. Under all the big recommender engines now that used to be classic, algorithms, is deep learning, just because this reinforcement learning based on deep learning is it's superior. It learns better. So it is transforming even under the covers recommender engines. There's no question. And that's why, I said the integrative aspects where you've got still classic stuff, because these recommender engines still do have classic scoring systems, but they also have deep learning with it. You combine them, you get kind of the best of both worlds.
I think my question was with generative AI. Now, deep learning also existed before the transformer model came to play. So are you seeing anything with the integrative aspect on some use cases where they're using deep learning, which existed and which hopefully is getting better by the day, and generative AI? Are you seeing some unique use cases like that?
Well, Google and Bing search would be an example where we're putting generative AI into the classic algorithm. So that's right off the bat. Now, I will say I work with a couple startups that are focused on the media industry, right? Big media. And there, it's just beginning, but media will be almost surely transformed, where the generative AI will be producing more and more stuff. Now it produces images that might be integrated with classic sort of media, but just on the cusp will be more video, which is more computationally sort of intensive. So that space is an example of one where, I mean, at the board level, right? I mean, in this case, we're suppliers, so we're basically the disruptor. But it's an interesting thing to watch the large media companies, because they're kind of in a tizzy, as you might have read anyways, with layoffs, et cetera. Many of them, in my opinion, will be blindsided because we and others are all going after the whole new generative era of media. So, I mean, that's just one example.
That's great. So they're creating content basically based on the deep learning and what they're seeing.
Yeah, if you look at the way media actually works, I didn't know that much about it until I sort of got into these startups. Already, a lot of what you would see in news broadcasts, et cetera, are pieced together, right, from different things. You know, here's an image that we get. Maybe we get it from Getty, or maybe we get it from internal. And, you know, there's just a lot of piecework anyways. More and more, you'll just be able to generate that stuff, and then, you know, a person will kind of put it together. But that's clear. And other big companies like Adobe is all over that space big time, and will be taking up more and more of the space that's been in traditional media.
Okay. Any other questions or comments, Marnie?
Yeah, I have one. This has been an excellent presentation, and thank you for the invitation. And Stephen, Dan, this is excellent. And Anu, you brought up something, and we've just sort of segued into a question I have in terms of a service provider. I'm not an AI expert by any means. This is well beyond my pay grade, but one of the implications of AI that does concern me is around protecting intellectual property, and how to protect the reputation, the brand, the integrity of a firm when they're depending on other providers to deliver content. And I have a really relevant example. I hired a firm a few weeks ago to write some content, and that content was clearly not aligned with my style, our values. And I did a test on the content, and it came back that 89% generated by Chat GPT. And so now I'm placed in a situation where I could be compromising the copyright of another provider. I don't know where that falls, but I would love your perspective in terms of how that manifests and how we protect against that type of a risk. Because the last thing we want is to be, is litigation for infringement of copyright or other intellectual property.
John, do you want to take this one, since this is your area of expertise?
I'm certainly passionate about the topic. So the issue is absolutely in flux, and it is the subject of a huge amount of litigation at the moment. Mm-hmm. And every country is grappling with this. In the United States, several publishers are, there already are class action lawsuits against OpenAI on the copyright issue. So, and some of the copyright issue crosses over into privacy law issues as well. It's very, very complex. So there's intellectual property and privacy. Think of a Venn diagram. You have contractual relationships. We do know that vendors, the AI vendors are talking with Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Associated Press, and Associated Press has signed a license agreement with OpenAI. The copyright issues are probably going to be addressed in the courts. That's going to be the least certain venue for decisions. So my suggestion, and I have to emphasize, since I am a lawyer, I'm not giving legal advice, and I have no choice. I'm under an ethics code obligation. I have to do that, and I'm not establishing an attorney-client relationship with you. But because I actually have 4 compliance certifications as well, and I have to do that. But
I appreciate that.
Really going to come down to what are your company's values and what efforts are you going to take to promote your values, to live out your values. So one of the issues you discussed is already arising, let's say on Twitter, when you have a tweet that contains keywords that your company would find offensive and your stakeholders would find offensive, but the recommender engine in Twitter will associate what you consider to be offensive content with that. That's a risk, and you mentioned that. So you're going to have to take action that's consistent with your values. Now, the 7 vendors in the United States, which of course this would, they're in Canada as well, made a voluntary commitment to the White House in the United States that they would watermark content. Is a voluntary commitment enforceable? Well, in common law jurisdictions, generally no. But in civil law jurisdictions, a verbal promise can be enforceable. And then do you have ethics policies? So this is where the question arises, will your business derive a competitive advantage and be valued higher among your stakeholders by how you handle GPT generated content? And I personally think there's going to be a huge amount of litigation, and I believe I'm actually developing a curriculum for the Bonar Institute on the topic of responsible AI. We plan to release that for purchase in September, and I'll be giving that program. So I'm researching this issue all the time. And so I know that your business is involved in branding, and your clients come to you for branding advice. And I would, if you want to associate AI with your personal brand, I would say be extremely aware of the legal and regulatory.
No, we've since parted ways with that firm because it was just not acceptable.
Yes.
So thank you for that. And
I will say,
sorry.
I do want to just note one thing. There's a famous case, and I cannot remember the lady's name. She's deceased, but her cells were used in medical research, and without her permission, without her knowledge, and they were used for decades, and billions of dollars of profit were generated through the research for medical procedures and medications for cancer treatment based on her cells. And it took several decades for her family to get compensation and recognition. I believe that intellectual property issues with AI are going to be similar. We're going to see litigation that takes decades. And I believe in the US and possibly Canada as well, the parliamentary powers and the legislature will be unable to act for whatever reason, and it's going to be in the court system and in the court of public opinion. So your values and purpose are going to be essential, and your awareness of your stakeholders is going to be essential. Anu, your hand is
Thank
raised.
you, John.
Thank you, Maureen.
I think a few things I wanted to add to that, John. Really well said. You know, the leading LLM owners have kind of committed to the White House, but I think there'll be genuine technological, shortcomings, basically, because ultimately these models are working on their own. And I think I read an article, I have to go back and check, but I think OpenAI or someone had an ethics team and that has kind of dissolved. And I think some of it is just because it's not like they don't believe in ethics. I think Sam Altman, Microsoft, all of them, Satya Nadella, they're all very committed to doing this ethically. But I think there are just technological, limitations on what they can do. Now, if you go to Bing just attribute, when they give out some, answers, Bing attributes what the source of those answers were. So that's a good thing. But I don't know how well it will be doing also, like how well it's pulling out the sources. Is it missing out some source somewhere? Nobody really knows. And I think the way one has to look at LLMs, this is my thought, given the limitations of LLM, because even the technologists don't know it so well, is actually to have your own user open LLM, basically, open source LLM, have it in your environment, and then fine tune it to your data. If you're using a private LLM like a ChatGPT, etc., where you're paying for it, you can access all the responses. I think it's really good for things like conversational, doing some initial research, but not to rely on that completely. It's great for conversational. So, for example, I was talking to Steve earlier, where we are saying, how do you combine machine learning ML with LLMs and generative AI? You could use it because machine learning can give you the answers, but then you can marry it with the LLM to produce it in a conversational style so anyone can use that information easily. So those purposes are great, and you can use things like ChatGPT. But if you had to use a private, closed source LLM where you really don't have access to the parameters, how they're doing the weights, etc., I think the best thing then to use it for conversational purposes or for some basic research, but then really have someone else eyeball it. There is another famous case where a lawyer actually used ChatGPT. They got references to cases, and they cited those cases to present the case why there was actually a person suing an airline. And it cited cases where similar cases had happened, and the verdicts were in favor of the plaintiffs. And actually, those cases just didn't exist. ChatGPT just created the whole thing. And I've personally seen it. I've asked for articles. It'll give me really long links with persons' names. Those links just don't exist. I've never found those links. It's completely hallucinating. So you just have to be extremely careful.
If I could just say, Maureen, I think your question is very salient at a broader level. And Anu, you're making this point very vividly, that and Steve touches on this very beginning, like the fundamentally unpredictable nature of LLM technology. But all new technologies, when they come on, there a lot of unpredictability involved with them in terms of what they'll produce and how they'll perform. And the vendors and the consultants are going to be making promises about what the technology can do, and these are compelling promises, and so they're very hard to resist. And so it's expected that there will be hiccups. What I think this general tendency points to is the importance, as I was saying before, of making digital innovation a core competency. You have not just an AI czar or even an AI center of excellence, but that's embedded within a function in the organization that can help with the adoption as well as the creation of new strategic value, as we put it, new products and stuff with the technology, so that anybody in the organization, working on a marketing project or whatever they may be working on, they have a resource they can go to ask a question. And there's a central, vehicle inside the organization that's building that knowledge base and expertise around what the risks and the benefits and realities of the new technology are.
That's excellent. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone. It has come time to end our webinar. I certainly wish we could go longer. The comments are rich and interesting and useful, and there's a lot to think about. Dan and Steve, thank you for your time today and sharing your expertise. We will be posting the recording. It will probably take about a week, and we invite you to sign up for the Bonar Bulletin. And you will see our posting of the webinar recording on LinkedIn. And thank you to everyone who participated today. And I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day and a fantastic week.